Authentication in payment systems and sort of the history of how we ended up in this place and where we seem to be going next, and whether we can learn some lessons from the usability issues with the past systems to make sure the new technology works better. So I've entitled this "Smile to Pay, You Must Be Joking." So to give away the plot a little bit at the end, I think there is currently a bit of an unseemly rush in towards adopting biometrics for quite security sensitive things without really having worked through the potential attacks and consequences. The background, thank you, Costa, is very kind to point out that this was, it's not quite 25 years, it was published in 1999, and it is very widely cited, even though, to be honest, I sometimes despair a little bit when I read papers who cite it. I've actually been thinking recently about setting up a website where authors can basically post all the misquotes of their work, and they basically say, yes, thank you very much for citing my paper, but what you wrote, my paper says, actually isn't true. And I think with users are not the enemy, what I more find is that sometimes people cite it as a very shorthand for, well, usability is important, but they haven't actually, I think very few authors in my experience have actually grasped like what it really said at the end of the paper, which is this is not about making, sort of like being able to make people do certain things. This is about actually recognizing that security that in order to comply with security, we need to actually deal with a major design failure here. And it's not purely a technology design failure, is that if organizations think they can just push all sorts of workload down onto their employees and nobody has to be accountable for this extra work that they create, that just doesn't work in reality. So this is not purely a technology issue. But one of the arguably frustrating things was, even though what we pointed out in the paper is that, well, your average human being and the way human memory is built is you can maybe have 2 or 3 different passwords that you use frequently and somehow manage with those. But who just has 3 or 4 different passwords, right? In reality, what we showed in the study is even in this one organization, people need it for work, anything upwards from 16, and if you then change them regularly, you create a massive problem. We also pointed out that actually the vast majority of failures has to do with infrequent authentication, not with those passwords, like your departmental password here that you use every day. That becomes automatic, and it doesn't, until somebody forces you to change it, it doesn't create you any problems, right? But the argument that we made is that it's ridiculous to have, from a usability point of view, to have a single form of authentication and use that regardless of whether you use it frequently or infrequently, and how risky it, what actually is the security risk that's associated here. That doesn't make sense to users, and really very little happened. For about 15 years, passwords were still very much used for pretty much every form of authentication. And so the situation we ended up with in a paper we published in a study funded by NIST, that we published in 2014, was that we ended up in a state I describe as the great authentication fatigue. That really, people literally got pushed to the point that they've absolutely had it. Particularly if you look at large commercial organizations or large government organizations where, you get like very sophisticated policies and they all mandate things and it's all just being pushed down on people. And so what you're looking at is people have to perform on average 20 authentications a day. In various studies, it's very clear that at least 10% of authentications fail, and then you get a whole sort of rat's tails of consequences from those failures, and all that adds up to quite a significant loss of time that people face every day, right? And so my famous one is, where you get the attention of the board of a company is when you say, like, do you realize your people spend 30 minutes a day on average on authentication related activities, right? But in productivity terms, that's massive, right? That's a massive loss of productivity. And that really has been, that productivity loss has been largely hidden. So what we actually pointed out in this paper with NIST was it's worse than that. So because we had previously only tracked the actual time people were spending on authentication, what we hadn't actually tracked properly was the impact on the primary task that people were doing. So what this diagram that's in the paper is basically, and it's in HCI in general, I think we've now really come back to realizing the importance of the interruption effect. So people can perform well on a primary task if they can complete it uninterrupted. If what you're doing is constantly interrupting people's primary tasks, you're paying an extra overhead in terms of people having to restart those primary tasks, right? And what we found here is like that when authentication and a difficult form of authentication, where people can't immediately just do it because it's an automatic well-known task, is when you then return to the primary task, you're having to redo about 40% of the work that had already been expended on the task. Right? And if you start adding that on to the half hour that you're doing per day, the whole thing gets, the cost of it becomes pretty enormous. And what you can find is if you just listen to people and if you just look at what's happening out there, basically people have hate lists about authentication. And repeated authentication to the same system is one of them. So when you've got, and that's of course different security policies, that different security experts put in place start to combine to create these impacts on users that they find really annoying. So basically if you have enforced screen locks every 15 minutes, so people get very, very frustrated because they say I've sat here for 2 hours, I haven't moved, but I still have to prove to the system every 15 minutes it's me. Well, and guess what happens? So people start installing mouse jigglers to stop the screen lock from kicking in. And when they, after 2 hours, do get up and walk away, they forget they've done that, right? And then they leave the computer wide open. So this kind of story is, that's what you see repeating all the time. So it's not great for usability. The users feel that the whole thing is unreasonable. And the workaround, the ways of how they cope with that is not really good for security. So in frequently used systems, and I just wish we could have a law once and for all that systems you only log into once a month or even less frequent, you should have a queued recall system for that rather than an unaided recall, which is what passwords is. So it's a system where you just have to recognize various things, various aspects of it, like whether that is recognizing your pictures amongst a set of pictures or whatever. There's plenty of in the literature in usable security that Costa talked about. There's plenty of examples. A valid password. People are just running out of ideas of something that complies with the policy and that people will accept, and and this kind of that basically encapsulates the kind of frustration and pain that people have. Managing a high number of different credentials, because it's the interference effect. It's not just the usability of one password or lack of usability of one password. It's if you have several similar ones, that in human memory they sit in the same kind of bucket, and then they interfere with each other. And even in that particular study, also the use of tokens that in the US government was actually quite strongly enforcing on. These are smart cards, often referred to as a PIV cards, or the RSA token, as people have actually pointed out, there is a significant cost associated with having those, having to remember to carry it all the time. And what you can see is, I just want to go just very quickly rattle through this to get to the payment part, is so people start to reorganize. This is what we're now seeing, is this is the downstream consequence. People start to reorganize their work in order to minimize the exposure to authentication. right? And that means a lot of, from a commercial organization's point of view, that effect is really drastic, right? If you basically had nicely optimized business process flows that, for instance, rely on certain things being done in a continuous fashion, but now your staff are starting to batch them, and only do them twice a day instead of continuously working through them. You know, the implications of that are pretty serious. But also people are opting just out of using certain services. In US government agencies, people just return their laptops and say, keep it, you know, I'm just not dealing with this anymore. And when they say like, oh, but you can't log in if you're away, you know, at a conference or something. And they go like, well, tough. You know, everybody has to wait for it to, they get my email replies when I get back. Hence again, you know, this impact on productivity. And in the most drastic cases, I mean, in works we've done with banks, with basically trading banks as opposed to high street banks, is, you know, when that people feel they can't actually realize their ideas and their best because security gets in the way so much, so they leave the organization and go elsewhere. And you're paying all that price in terms of productivity when you're not really getting any security in return either. So the kind of like workarounds and non-compliance, you know, this is pretty rampant in both in commercial organizations and even in government organizations. So sort of writing down and sharing passwords really is the least of it. You might think it's relatively harmless, you know, provided your colleagues are all very honest, but it actually creates a habit of disclosure, and then people just forget that they're doing it, you know. And this is the oblivious disclosure is I've been collecting both pictures and videos, and I've got close to 100 pictures. I've got dozens of videos recorded of live TV of these kind of passwords leaks. You know, people just forget they're doing it. So, you know, camera crew comes in and say, you know, can you do an interview? And, you know, while we're at it, we'll throw in the network authentication key as well. I mean, this is just one example, you know, and here in the basically behind Prince William up there, you know, the MilFlip login details posted on. You know, that's what the reality is, you know, up and down the country in organizations. And we just have to basically admit this is not fit for purpose, right? The move to new devices has also made things worse, and this is basically one of the key factors that's driving the change we now see by the banks, right? Entering, if you've got an 8, 10, 12 character password on a keyboard, you know, you get a slightly increasing curve of the amount of time it takes to enter it and the number of errors, the number of failures you get. Do the same thing on a touchscreen device, and it's ×3 to ×5. So the entry time, you know, it's not a gentle increase like on the keyboard. It basically, it shoots up pretty drastically, and the error rate is up to 5 times as high. So guess what? You know, what you'll find in many organizations, if you look at the password files, is that the number of passwords in those files is the more people have. You know, we passed 2 years ago, I think we passed the point where the majority of passwords are now entered on touch screens as opposed to keyboards, right? So this is the bigger chunk now. And people figure out pretty quickly and without explicitly communicating about this, that there is a small number of passwords that comply with the policy, you know, of how we think we make passwords strong, and that only require one toggle between soft keyboards on the screen. Yeah. From a security point of view, the consequence is disastrous. You know, you now have a small number of passwords that the attackers also have figured out. Right, so in the UK, the banks, this is sort of one of these curious things, the US, and then by implication the rest of the American continent seems to be sort of like pretty following pretty slowly after this, is they basically said, okay, so we shouldn't just rely on the password, we should make it proper two-factor authentication, we should introduce tokens. And the UK banks basically went through a massive project where they sat down for several years and talked, and the result was that they had a specification for devices to read the kind of, you know, your banking card And the great triumph of the standardization is you could use a card reader from any bank, and you could put any card from any other bank into that card reader, right? So if you had, as most people now do, several accounts with different banks, if you go on the road, you only had to take one of those card readers. So far, so good. That you'd think that was a good thing, but the study that we've done and that subsequently various colleagues also followed up on, what you get from if you ask the customers is they just hate these two-factor authentication. Right? It's they complain about the fact that if you don't use it frequently, they still find they forget to bring the token when they have it. And then once they implemented a card reader that could take any card, they then all went and developed different ways of how the user has to interact, of how the user interacts with the device. So whether you, for instance, need the reader at all for a particular transaction varies between banks. Some require it for every single transaction, others only when you have a new payee, yet others only if it's a transaction over £5,000, you know. Then when you read the instructions, some they refer to a password, others to a passcode, others to a passphrase, you know, so different terms for different things. And what people were telling us in this study was, you know, they just found the whole thing incredibly confusing and very painful. And basically nobody's got a good thing to say about these things. And what came out very clearly is when we asked them, so how would you like to authenticate? You know, how would you like to prove it's you when your bank account's being accessed? Biometrics comes up quite frequently. And so what we then get is, you know, is that this idea that, you know, we've really got to get rid of the password is, you know, so if Wired says, you know, it's had it, then we've definitely followed suit. And so we've now got these two things coming together, several things coming together. It's the fact we have the touchscreen devices, it's the fact that we have biometrics, and that people are basically going, you know, the standard kind of password just doesn't work, you know, let's get rid of it. And the FIDO Alliance has, of course, created a framework how you might authenticate with tokens, with biometrics, and various other things. So that's the idea that biometrics coming to the rescue here is a big one. Now, I just quickly slip in like one non-payment example of how you can introduce biometrics and not make the problem any better at all. And that's what we saw in the NIST study, is that they said, okay, you're all complaining about passwords, you know, have a fingerprint reader. And so about a quarter of staff in this organization took it, you know. But what happened was every 90 days when their password expired, they had to basically go in their drawer trying to find the piece of paper where they'd written down the password, then go type that password in, sit there, think up another password that complied with the policy and wasn't the same, you know, that used previously in the last 10 times previously. They had to type that password in and then remember to write it down and put it on a piece of paper to lock it away, re-enroll their fingerprint against this, and until in 90 days' time. Yes?
Okay, so they didn't change any of the old stuff.
Yeah.
You could opt out by doing the fingerprint.
Yeah.
Did they add a feature that if you enrolled your finger against a particular password, no other finger could be enrolled? Because people were clearly not taking care of their password, so it could disappear. Mm-hmm. So they basically changed nothing except.
Right, and that's not, you know, I mean, basically this will not be no surprise to smart people like you. You know, this is not the way to do it. You can't just basically treat this as a front. You just rip out something, put another front end on it, but you don't touch the infrastructure underneath. Right? This is and this is actually I've come to, you know, because I've been having this argument with my own central computing people in my university, you know, for 15 years now about why they shouldn't have these types of passwords and why they shouldn't expire them at the frequency that they do. And it all comes back to, at the end of the day, you know, I slightly exaggerate, you know, but they basically hunker down on the floor and start crying and say like, but I can't possibly change this because of, I'd have to, you know, if I replace this, you know, I'd have to rip out all this and redo all this kind of stuff. It's because it's so deeply embedded in organizational infrastructures, and they just basically go like, let's not go there, you know. And that's, at the end of the day, is the reason often why they won't seriously look at replacements. So that's basically in a corporate context like this. But of course, in the consumer space and also in payment systems, this is not necessarily such an issue, right? So when Apple introduced so even before Apple came out with this phone, is what happened in the UK was that they released a banking app. And they basically said, you know, when people complained about the two-factor authentication, they said, like, go and use the app on the phone. And the second factor was, in addition to recognizing your device, was a one-time password that would be sent to your phone. Right. Kind of, yeah, you know, some people say that's fine, you know, but there's other things happening. But when now Apple came out with the Touch ID, sort of the whole thing was like the banking people went, great, you know, we can make people, have people use their fingerprint, and, you know, finally the calls to the help desks and the complaints and everything will stop, you know, a nice, easy to use app on the phone, just put down your finger to confirm your identity, and hey presto. And I think it's, if you've been, you know, sort of been involved with biometrics for a long time, you know, like I've basically been involved with biometrics for almost as long as I've been involved with passwords, is you look at and you say like, okay, Apple is actually, they dared to break, you know, with some of the conventions that were previously associated with how you enroll the fingerprint, for instance. So traditionally you put your, you know, you basically call this a slap, you put your finger down 3 times. And depending on, if you get a little bit too much variation in it, that has some quite bad consequences for the template that's being calculated as a result. So Apple basically went like, okay, we'll make people spend more time on enrollment, and we'll get a nice proper fingerprint, you know, an almost fully rolled fingerprint on the device. And we have a nice feedback mechanism to show people how much they've covered, you know, so we're explaining why we need them to do it again, why we need them to put the finger down again and again, and we're encouraging them to basically move it around so you get a proper rolled fingerprint, or an almost rolled fingerprint. So that's so they traded that effort on enrollment versus better recognition performance throughout. I think that's a smart move. They also decided to keep the PIN alive. So they basically said, is, you know, a very common problem you find with biometric systems is that the PIN is used as a backup if the biometric fails, right? And the biometric, we have to be honest, you know, it can fail for any number of reasons. Simple things such as temperature, you know, humidity, if it's too cold, humidity, all that kind of stuff. And if, you know, just gone through a nice long summer and happily authenticated every day, and then 6 months later you suddenly have to remember the backup PIN, well, good luck, you know. You probably wouldn't, certainly most people can't. And so to have a backup, to have a knowledge-based credential as a backup that you haven't used for a very, you know, we know what happens with infrequently used authentication with knowledge-based credentials. It doesn't work. So they decided, let's keep the PIN alive so there always is a backup there even if the biometric fails. Yeah, you know, quite good. And effectively this opened the floodgates, you know, sort of like 6 million, you suddenly got, you know, the whole biometrics industry was going like, wow, you know, 6 million users, you know, added in a few months, you know, that's just huge. And they were all coming, all the banks in the UK were falling over themselves to come out with this. So these are the high street banks. HSBC came out a couple of weeks ago and basically said, fingerprint authentication on the phone, but also a significant number of customers prefer to have phone-based interactions with the bank. So they, rather than typing, you know, basically typing the amounts and the account numbers in, they basically want to ring up and do this, and they basically use voice recognition for that. So which is a combined static and dynamic biometric, which basically looks at both your voice characteristics, but also at how you say certain particular phrases that they're looking at. Barclays had actually already been using this fairly quietly for about 18 months because they only used it with their very desirable customer clientele. They have a subdivision called Barclays Wealth. They use an American product called Nuance for the voice recognition. And effectively, so as I said, the floodgates. So everybody's not talking about, so face recognition is the missing one in this set. So MasterCard and Visa as well have been going like, well, you'll just authenticate with your selfie, from now on. That will work. Last year at CeBIT, which is the big European computing fair that happens every year, Jack Ma, the founder and owner of Alibaba, basically demonstrated what he called the smile to pay, which is, again, face recognition on the phone. And he basically demonstrated this live at the thing. And again, it was this phrase came up, it should be as easy to pay by phone as taking a selfie. So basically, from a user acceptance point of view, on the one hand, lots of people like selfies, maybe as grouchy old computing people are slight exception. Most people seem to like it very much. So this was from if you'd been working in biometrics, this was a big surprise, this particular announcement. Anybody can figure out why?
Take a picture of someone. If you took a picture of someone, I took a picture of you and tried to pay it as you.
Yeah.
And I was taking a picture of you, I could do it.
Oh, so somebody else. Well, of course, it doesn't just rely on the picture, right? This is the device is registered, and there is a token on the device, and so on. It'll take, basically, it'll look at a whole thing. But in terms of smiling in face recognition,
you're sad.
Do
you happen to be sad?
Yeah, so my first comment was, so if you're really upset about the amount you just had to pay for something, that's particularly good,
You're trying to buy an airplane ticket to go to your parents' funeral.
Yeah. So that's a user, that's a clear user acceptance usability issue. But the other part is like if you still remember when you had to, do you guys not have to provide machine readable photographs for your passports? Right? Smiling is a big no-no on those. They always tell you that you must have a neutral expression. And that is because the distance between the corners of the mouth and other parts of the face is a key part of the measurement. And so they're always like telling you not to smile. Okay? So they might have simply inverted it here and just said like, okay, if you're basically smiling and we'll just take it all from there, or they may have some, I don't know what. The secret sauce at the moment seems to be some deep learning algorithm running, that they're all saying that can suddenly deal with something that face recognition couldn't deal with for its entire history. But we'll see. You have a question?
It's not as if you start off with and then you smile. It's not the act of smiling.
No, they're saying, so basically they're basically saying so. But we're waiting. We'll wait. It'll be very interesting to see what happens here. So other types of biometrics that are coming out now is basically eye tracking, which is something that Alex De Luca had already started to publish some papers on 6-7 years ago, and people at the University of Washington are at it. So that seems to and this is sort of like the question of what's happening now. What the banks are doing at the moment is they're effectively using a single static biometric. Arguably, in the case of voice recognition, it's a mixture of a static and a behavioral biometric. But that I think what we see emerging is that actually, in terms of when you look at the accuracy, the performance of the systems that are coming out, a combination that certainly the behavioral biometrics are outperforming the static biometrics in terms of accuracy. So by behavioral biometrics, so here, like basically how your gaze tracks across the screen, right? And so the idea of having a simple knowledge-based item, such as what your PIN is, and then the way you look across the screen, you know, how you basically look at those numbers, how your eye tracks when you tracks and focuses on those numbers. That seems to be, you know, really in terms of performance a better bet. Yeah.
Working with a few continuous authentication based biometrics, one thing I've come to find a big problem is what about a single person having different, like going through different like issues which causes continuous biometrics to fail. Like for example, sometimes a distressed person would move a mouse a different way than someone who's okay. A person with a migraine might gaze on his own differently than he would when he's okay. How do you how does one vary?
This is you've basically absolutely hit your nail on the head. So there is no we have so far not found any biometric. I mean, we as you know the research community in general has not found a single biometric that isn't affected by that. As I said, even your lovely fingerprint sensor on the iPhone, you know, if it gets too cold or if your finger's too wet, it won't, you know, it won't work. Certainly, also if you had some serious cuts on your fingers, it would be the same thing. Yes, you know, if you do gait recognition, looking at how people walk, if somebody basically twists their ankle, or, you know, that would be. It's an interesting question whether, you know, as you said, the migraine is an interesting example, whether it would actually affect. So I think what we see is at the moment the whole idea that you could run it without a backup, without a fallback authentication is just, you know, it's just not possible. So at the moment we'd always have to consider, you know, consider that. I think the work on the behavioral biometrics, so I'm particularly familiar with Roy Maxian's work at CMU, you know, where he actually showed is you can make this fiendishly accurate, and again by having a relatively high investment in the enrollment period, you can have, you know, then how you type a particular word. So your password might be something simple like chocolate, you know, but how you type it, you know, so basically having a simple secret and then the behavioral, it seems overall at the moment a fairly low effort way to go forward. You know, And I think it would be quite interesting to see how that's different. On the phone, arguably, it would probably be how to use the swipe authentication, but so to not just use the pattern, but to use that use the pressure and how you do this as well. Arguably, we could even have a password, a simple password typed in on the soft passwords, because the way of how we mishit those keys and come to those errors is idiosyncratic but systematic. So that's you know, what we are basically, with the possibility of having something that was previously a problem could suddenly become an asset, and we could get what I basically called a few years ago zero effort, one step two-factor authentication. You know, from the user's point of view, it's one step, but the system takes two factors from that, and then arguably you have additional factors proving that it's your, you know, you've got the tokens on the device and so on. And that certainly is, you know, from when you speak to users about it, they go like, they're quite intrigued by this, and they go like, you know, yeah, that's certainly great in terms of usability. And we've got various other things coming out. So I always used to ridicule in talks an NSPW paper from about 10 years ago, which stuck EEG sensors on people's head and said, oh, I can actually detect how you think, you know, ask people to think their password and then read off the head waves, right? And I was basically going like, that's ridiculous, you know, who's going to run around with an EEG scanner? And I was wrong, because in the gaming community, direct input has become a very big thing. You know, they don't want to go via a keyboard or via a controller anymore. They want to play through direct input, and the emotive helmet is a consumer device that allows you to do just that. So maybe we can, maybe Julie Thorpe was onto something here, and I didn't recognize it. But of course, that the key, the $164,000 question that we still have is, so how secure is this stuff, right? How easy is it to overcome it? Because if attackers can trivially get around it, clearly that's not going to last very long with the banks. And so we have seen various types of attack on fingerprint and face biometrics, and it's very clear that some of the biometrics are quite vulnerable to relatively simple attacks. So the Chaos Computer Club already pointed out a few years ago, I think it was year before last, 2 years ago, they simply took, they have a long and distinguished history of busting fingerprints. So they published the fingerprints of all German cabinet members because they'd basically taken them with aluminium dust and then reproduced them with wood glue and so on, and proved they could overcome the fingerprint readers with that. But here they said, like, well, why make that effort? All you need to do is take a high resolution photograph, of somebody you don't even need to get to their fingerprints or close to them. And they basically did this, yeah?
Well, the basic rule for passwords used to be never use the same password on two systems.
Yes.
I only got one finger. I got 10, but... So you've just given all the information to the other system.
Well, the argument you could put against that is you can, the way the template that the system actually compares, right? The system doesn't compare image to image, it compares a template, and you could just use a different algorithm and generate a different template if you need to replace it.
Well, no, but the enemy system that I choose to use because I don't realize it's the enemy. Mm-hmm. It just has really good security, so I have to...
Yes, yeah, of course you can harvest. That's the argument. You can actually harvest it. So I think it's very clear. It's like, you would, there's nothing, it can only work as part of a two-factor system. It could never work by itself. But basically, so the CCC people basically made it 2.5D, i.e. Sort of like a gummy finger and not just an overlay to beat the system. But that actually now turns out to be a relatively simple way of doing this, because last week Anil Jain and one of his guys from Massachusetts State University basically published this paper where they said all you need is your, just use your printer. Basically, so they're again basically taking, and use some special cartridges, so you can do that. Have we got time to have a look at the video of how they're doing this? Hopefully, week go. Let's do it this way. Should work, hopefully. Yeah. So that's even simpler then. Of course,
This was not Touch ID, right? This was not Touch ID. The video?
Yes, it was Touch ID.
I think it was Android.
No, the first one was, they did it on Touch ID, then they did it on Android, the back, the one with the back, and the back.
And the back, yes.
Again on Touch ID, and then they did it with the Samsung.
Yeah. So, so that's clearly an issue. I mean, of course, you can argue from an attacker's point of view, going around and collecting people's fingerprints is quite a bit more of an effort rather than going and harvesting a password file and then being able to do a broad attack. So.
I'm just kind of curious. Will the fingerprints cause the temperature into the consideration? Because if you use the picture, then might be like.
Right. Yes. So this is, of course, is the question, and which is, so this has been, of course, the magic silver bullet with this kind of attack is supposed to be liveness detection. The same is like, so the equivalent face recognition attack is that you just hold up a photograph or you play a video of a person on a screen and hold that up to the camera. And so liveness detection, and effectively there is effectively some cheap forms of liveness detection. So the cheapest form is something you can do with face recognition. Is you can ask people to say, you can give them a prompt that they have to respond to, right? And so if you have a pre-recorded video, the attacker can't do that because they can. So with the finger ones, this is what they do traditionally with other fingerprint scanners is they're basically looking for a pulse behind it, but with the fingerprint sensor on the iPhone, you can't do it. And actually, to me, it raises a really, really interesting question, where the question is why? Why did they go for that type of fingerprint reader? Because the lesson from fingerprint readers that have been used, not on this massive scale, but nevertheless being used in, prisons and various other high security installations. And even on laptops, the lesson we learned fairly quickly is don't do this. Right, you're much better off using a swipe sensor that you pull the finger over, because that is a lot harder to attack than just putting the finger down. And on the phone, you have no way of putting in, or at the moment, we don't have a cheap, effective way of putting in liveness detection. So where they have actually done this is in the cars. So where fingerprint readers have been used in high-end cars in quite a number of countries. And there they basically have liveness detection, so they look for a pulse behind the finger, so you can't just put that kind of sort of thing on top. It's quite interesting, as the guy sort of said in my previous slide here, is to actually explain this to people. That, and it's just because these things have happened. So when they introduced fingerprints for social security payments in South Africa, and when they first introduced the fingerprint readers in the high-end cars that were shipped to Asia, there were attacks with severed fingers and so on. And that's, of course, it's like, and he's basically pointing out, yes, we have the technology, but we don't even want to talk about, what the risk, the risk here is. This is going to take a slight detour to actually point out, of course, what potentially lies further down the road, goes way beyond payment systems and just, quickly proving who you are. One of the things that I actually like about the sensor in the car is that the overall solution they're offering is not just to prove, to only let the registered owner of the car to drive it. I mean, this feature is the reason why they put this feature in is because it's very useful in fleet cars, in company cars, which are used by multiple people, because what the car will do when you go down when you do this is it won't just start the engine, it will basically adjust the seat position to the particular person, the mirrors and everything will go, and that's what I call productive security. You get more than just security as the payback.
Do you feel that the stake, when the stakes go higher, the way you authenticate users change? For example, like the thing is, I can't imagine this being in a low-end car. This has to be in a high-end car. But if a car is worth like $500,000, then I can totally imagine someone who really wants to steal the card, punch the user in the face over and over again until he puts the finger on the card and throws them out and then drives the car. And like,
but that's, yeah, and
so
yes, basically.
The thing is that the level or the incentive based on what you're trying to do.
Absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely right. But what of course is, one of what might drive what I want to point out here is what might drive the adoption is you might have completely, basically much more sophisticated value chains coming behind this, so that you're not just taking the biometric, you're doing continuous sensing, so Ford basically looked at this, and so they have then sensors embedded in the seat, and they're going, so we can detect when you're about to have a heart attack, and drive you safely, basically put you safely on the side of the road. Well, given we now have self-driving cars, I would expect to be driven straight to the hospital by the car immediately, right? And the same is basically happening with the data that we're generating through things like the Fitbits and Apple Watch, right? You basically, there's so much biometric data you're generating here, and it can, of course, basically the scenarios of how this is being used is endless. This whole kind of like continuous, round the clock monitoring of biometrics, I think is quite, I'm not quite sure people understand how far this is potentially going. So these engagement pedometers used on school kids in some schools, and no less founded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? So they're constantly using your eye tracking, the eye tracking, the engagement, they're looking at exactly, what you've looked at, haven't looked at. The eye tracking can be used to check whether you've actually understood a particular passage or not, and then adjust, I don't know, trying to optimize your learning and so on. Even this is from this is actually a project from the Royal College of Art. In one of the degree shows a couple of years ago, they put forward the concept of the biometric toilet, where they basically said, so in the context of, you could see this as an extension to your Fitbit, which basically does additional analysis on your output to say how good that 15-kilometer run was for you today, or, how bad the 3 donuts you were. But it was also social commentary in that against the backdrop of shrinking resources, for instance, in healthcare, that in future whether you get access to these precious, increasingly shrinking resources will depend on you complying with particular rules, and that the biometric technology actually is, that's going to be the #1 candidate for checking whether you're doing this or not. So you can't lie anymore to your doctor about how much you drink, because he's just going to find out from your toilet. Unless we then all turn to athlete cheating methods and get our kids to give us some clean, I don't know, yeah.
This feels like very usual with Big Brother.
Yes, it is, and I think that's actually where I would, where I go quite at, where I end up at the end of this talk is the privacy implications of constant biometric monitoring are pretty serious, and I just basically want to point out that in terms of, if you look at how the simpler static biometrics can be attacked, it is pretty inevitable we end up with behavioral biometrics, and then the argument would be in the name of productive security, leverage, use something people are already using for other purposes, but that, then basically creates this massive cloud. So in terms of the payment systems, actually one key thing I would also say here is I asked the HSBC and First Direct when they 2 weeks ago basically made a big announcement about this, and I said, so what about your terms and conditions? Right. So what about if somebody, somebody basically like my deviant sibling with a coke habit or whatever nicks my phone and has made this overlay and now takes the money out of my account. So whose fault, basically am I liable for this? And they came back with a pretty standard response saying, well, we have these terms and we have our terms and conditions basically stipulate, what you have to do, and we'll stick with these terms and conditions. conditions, but effectively they were saying, when customers experience fraud, the vast majority of our customers are refunded immediately. It's only in cases where we have doubt, yada, yada, yada. But this kind of configuration where you essentially, and we published this paper at Financial Crypto last month, where we said is if you look at the terms and conditions around the use of pins, basically we cannot find a user, we've run studies and we cannot find a single customer who actually says they're complying with those terms and conditions of never reusing a pin, never sharing it with anybody else and so on, right? So they simply can't do that. So the terms, but given they have they say they can't do it. So the terms and conditions don't really reflect what's happening in life. I think with the biometrics, it's a different issue, is how do you actually prove you've complied with the terms and conditions, with a relatively complex technology like that. Sorry, you've been saying.
So earlier in the talk, you used the term identity theft.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't used to exist. And in fact, it's terms and conditions. That's a term invented by the bank for what used to be called fraud, where the bank was the victim. And they turned us into the victims simply by inventing a term and then embedding it.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a sort of like a campaign that we think needs to happen is customers should basically push back. The consumer organizations in various, certainly in the Western countries have also basically pointed this out, but I think it just needs to be much stronger. It's very clear to us, we observed that the banks were definitely very quick to move when they found, that people switched banks because they didn't like the two-factor authentication using the token, that they started, they felt that pain fairly quickly and started to respond. And I wish more people would do what I do is for instance, I don't do online banking because I think the terms and conditions associated with my bank's online banking are so, they're written again in the way like, pretty much it's like you say that everything is potentially your fault, you basically, they're safeguarding them against everything. So if something happens, how can I prove, that? And I said, they keep saying, don't you want to do online banking? You're a professor in computer science, for God's sakes, right? And I go, not until you change your terms and conditions, right? I'm not signing those terms and conditions. And I think more people need to do that, and then they will do that.
Just to add to this, Paul Van Uffert and his student did a study which they published at the SPW, where they looked at the terms and conditions of Canadian banks. And one of the things that you're expected to do if you do online banking is that you keep your computer free from viruses.
Yes. Who does, yes. And we all know that virtually nobody, maybe a few of us succeed in that, but that's the thing. So, I mean, clearly from the studies we've done with customers, it's very clear that the convenience of the biometric is a huge pull, and people basically, some of them almost like weep with relief, that they don't have to do the mental gymnastics associated with various passwords. I mean, particularly if you then have to basically remember the password and then enter, tell them or enter the 7th, 13th and 18th digit, of it. I mean, some people really basically already break into a sweat, just thinking about starting to call the bank because of things like. So to them, they're basically going like, yes, thank you, I'll have this. But it's not necessarily so. For face recognition in particular, I would actually predict that this whole idea about selfie authentication everywhere is not going to happen. I mean, we find that very much people differentiate, into a usability person. That doesn't come as a surprise. Basically, depending that people say they would find face recognition acceptable, depending on what the security level is, but also what is the general task, what is the environment that I am in, and what are the personal circumstances in which I find myself. So with the security level in particular, so they will accept it with something they see as a very high security risk, like like basically, like say, basically crossing a border, or some even say, yes, payment, access to my bank account, I put a very high security on it. Yes, but they wouldn't, for instance, for paying for things they regard as trivial, so for paying some tickets, for posting something on a forum, anything non-payment, they go like, that's ridiculous, and the phrase we hear very often is, because also they say like, what happens, so they take a picture, what then happens with this? I don't like having my face on the, everywhere on the internet. And I think the biometrics, the biometrics industry have really not done a very good job explaining how this works, and explaining that, for instance, with the so-called selfication, or with the fingerprint, the biometric actually remains on the phone. And the device then just sends a yes, no, successful match information back. But there are some face recognition systems out there, including one we have tested, where they actually transmit the picture back to the companies that does authentication. And this is basically increasingly what is happening, is that you basically get one single sort of, big trough of data being collected, So here my nightmare about all these things, it has already happened, it has already been realized. If you look at this company called Biometric, so really what's happening here certainly what's happening in the US is that the bigger banks are all getting fed up with the problem of authentication. And they're going, the customers keep bashing us for it, it's expensive, we keep changing and trying different things, the government keeps beating us up because they say it's not secure enough. You know what, we're in the money business, let somebody else take care of security. And so the biggest American bank, in fact, already contracts its authentication out now to this company called Biometric, which says nicely in there, if you go and look on their webpage, is that they collect up to 400 parameters of the individuals, i.e. the customer's behavior. So the whole shebang of like the device identity, but then also all the other things that banks currently use to safeguard transactions. Is this a usual transaction for you? Do you usually do it in the middle of the night? Do you always do you regularly send money from, to Tajikistan or whatever, taking that, but together with all the interaction information, right? So what they're looking at is with devices that allow eye tracking. They look at the eye tracking, they look at how you move the mouse across the screen and all of those things. All of these behavioral things basically get pooled in one system. And so they effectively then have they have a service level agreement, a contract with the bank that basically the bank will usually set a certain, either a level of security, how much fraud they're willing to accept, but also how many false rejections, i.e. how many customers they want to see inconvenienced, and of course they want to see the vast majority of the customers not inconvenienced. So those service providers are actually potentially the big privacy threat, right? And they are the ones where now all this comes together. So it's not the banks themselves, it's those guys. And they will, of course, start offering, at the moment, the banks are usually the high-end ones who pay most for it, but as more competitors will enter this market and do the same, it'll be basically put out to others. And so, since Target, for instance, clearly, it was Target, wasn't it, who likes to predict whether people are pregnant before they even know it, you can basically imagine what other questions, apart from is this the legitimate customers, they might ask from the biometric service providers they're doing. So I don't know. Me thinking about this, I think there is a potential for it turning into the ultimate privacy nightmare. And if you ask me, I'm not necessarily inclined to smile if they in order to pay. So thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take questions.
So the last one, the Biometric, where they're farming it out, I would think that opens up some different problems, which actually don't really have to do with my money or your money. So banks are sometimes criminal, and they do money laundering, etc. But generally speaking, in lots of countries like the US, UK, etc., they tend not to because the consequences are too high. So what they've just done is some mom and pop organization that may or may not, somehow satisfy the banks, they've gone completely, and so now that's all the authentication. So the mafia doesn't necessarily want to steal my money, they just want to launder their money. And if they can beat this authentication because they have a back door through it, that can be extremely valuable.
Yeah.
And it's not clear who's responsible. How does the, whatever the legal jurisdiction is, how are they going to track that all the way back to? I mean, for example, if you're using, your iPhone, would Apple be considered liable? Because that was the thing you were running your app on, and they said that nobody was supposed to be able to run unauthorized apps. And it seems to open up a giant can of worms when you get into all these different suppliers. It's one thing to go into an ATM, which is installed by the bank and owned by the bank. And, it's their problem, not yours.
Yes, very much so, and I completely agree. And this is also what we've said with the terms and conditions. That this is really really people. It would be in all of our interests if people just did not accept those terms and conditions anymore, because they're really palming it off on the, in this way. And it's like what first happened, when they see the so-called identity theft happened, that the victims are really in an absolutely awful position, when nobody will take any responsibility, nobody really particularly cares, and everybody says, but look at the terms and conditions. It's not my problem, right? And that's not the solutions we want. So that's really, I think basically it's not just basically us to take a very critical look at the technology itself, but really look at the whole circumstance, the policies and terms and conditions that are attached to it, that we should. And I think really finding ways of actually in a compact and understandable way communicating what you are responsible for or not responsible for is, so first of all, it has to be an equitable distribution, and secondly, you shouldn't put risks onto stakeholders that can't actually really manage them. Ultimately you're undermining, and this is like
you're talking about banks who issue credit cards to people who
yeah, of course. But ultimately, of course, it comes, that whole thing, it does come back to roost. If more and more people basically find themselves in a situation where they go bankrupt, or where they lose their money as a result of it, all of those are potential customers that go away. And they've learned the lesson the hard way from overselling. If you oversell credit, eventually you're going to run out of people you can sell any credit to, and that which is why now financial rehabilitation and so on is a big thing. Yeah. But I think really in the 21st century, customers just have to become more, I talk about, it's one of my favorite topics, I talk about unionization, of basically pushing back, of getting our own lawyers, getting our own representatives to push back against things. And I've seen that Tim Berners-Lee, for instance, when it comes to data collection on the web, he actually very much, he's been talking a lot to Consumer International, which represent, which is the international club of all the consumer protection agencies in the Western world, that he's very much talking to them about that. And I think we need to become, we can't have all this for free and, without really being clear about what is acceptable to us and what isn't. And I think we'll see this sooner or later. I think basically people will do this around the Fitbit, for instance, that they will basically set, not either they'll stop uploading their data to the central repositories altogether, unless they basically get clear assurances about how long the data will be there and what it can be used for and not can be used for. And if it's found to be used against your express, against the conditions that you gave, then there has to be a fine.
I think one discussion also kind of touches on the point of kind of inconsistency. People who make decisions are not really kind of liable for those decisions, and people who don't make decisions, they end up being liable for those decisions.
Yes.
So it's kind of general problem of economics.
Yes, but I think I find this actually, I don't know how we can get, ultimately, as I pointed out, you might get a short-term gain, and that's the problem, and you get away with it for a while, but ultimately it ruins the economic proposition for everyone. And I just wish they would understand that a collaborative, we've got enough problems with attackers who are trying to break in and steal our stuff. Is like if the decent people who in principle just trying to run a particular business or service, if we could just always think about setting the whole thing up as a collaborative system as opposed to an adversarial one, and manage the risks in a way that's equitable and in line with the abilities that the different stakeholders have, we'd get much better.
Thank you again.
Thank you.